What if the Thanksgiving you know, the Pilgrims, the feast, the smiling faces, was only one version of a deeper tale? What if it wasn't just about turkeys and gratitude, but survival, loss, and stories rewritten in silence? Not everything we inherit is true. Not every tradition tells the whole tale. So tonight, we begin again, from the quiet edges of memory. We remember a meal, but forget the winter that came before it. We celebrate unity, but overlook the silence after the drums. Thanksgiving holds a strange stillness, a hush that asks more than it answers. So, ask with me. Wander into the shadows of this holiday. Let's see what remains when we listen closely enough. Before we begin this journey, take a moment. Let the noise fall away. Let the light dim. And if stories like this feel like home, if truth wrapped in poetry helps you rest, subscribe. There are many more quiet tales still waiting in the dark. Thanksgiving didn't begin with a feast. It began with footsteps, soft ones, across pine needles, through riverside villages, under skies untouched by maps. Long before the Pilgrims, there were people here, nations of them, with stories, songs, and sacred ground. To understand this holiday, we must first meet those who were already home. Who were they? And what kind of land did they love? Long before white sails cut across the horizon, this land was not waiting to be discovered. It was already full of languages that curled like rivers, traditions layered like tree rings, and maps drawn in footsteps. The forest whispered names that no ship had heard. The skies were known by those who watched them every night, and the ground, soft, sacred, was not wilderness, but home. Villages stood quietly beneath canopies of cedar and pine. Paths wound through mountains and meadows, carried by moccasin feet, guided by memory, not compass. And so we begin, not with strangers arriving, but with those who had always been here. They were the Wampanoag, the Pequot, the Mohegan, the Nipmuc, the Narragansett. So many names, not relics, but songs still carried by the wind. Each tribe had its rhythm, its language, its way of marking time by the moon, or the cry of a migrating bird. They moved with the land, not against it. Their homes breathed with the seasons. They fished the rivers, planted the earth, honored the animals, and told stories that curled upward in smoke. These were not forgotten people, only voices we stopped listening to. And yet, if we lean in close enough, we might still hear them. At night, the forest glowed softly with firelight. Children gathered around the flames, wide-eyed as elders spoke of stars, of animals who once shaped the world, of ancestors who whispered through trees. These stories weren't written, they were remembered, passed from voice to voice, generation to generation, not in ink, but in rhythm. And as the sparks rose into the sky, each tale joined them, a glowing thread in the tapestry of memory. This was history not made of battles, but of breath. And it taught children something no book could hold, that to listen is to belong, And the fire, like the land, always made room for one more. Look closely at the soil, and you may still find the imprints, not of boots, but of bare feet. Soft steps pressed into the ground by hunters, gatherers, mothers carrying woven baskets, children chasing shadows through ferns. They knew the way by memory, not by signs, but by trees leaning like old friends, streams whispering familiar turns. Each path was a pulse, a heartbeat of a people who moved with the rhythm of the land. They did not build walls. They built relationships between earth and sky, between ancestor and child. To walk in their world was to walk in meaning. And if we pause, if we listen, perhaps the land will still tell us where they walked. Their homes were not castles. They were circles, built with bark and reeds shaped by hand, made to breathe with the weather. Inside, warmth came not from stone, but from firelight and voices. Walls did not echo, they embraced. There were no locks, no closed gates, only the rhythm of sharing. Corn pounded with care, tools passed between generations, cradle boards swaying gently as lullabies filled the smoke-sweet air. These homes didn't rise in pride. They rested in place, a reminder that shelter is not what you own, but where you're held. And outside those homes, the world waited, not as a threat, but as kin. Spring taught planting, summer taught growth, autumn taught gratitude, winter taught patience. For the people of this land, each season was not a clock, but a voice. They watched for birds returning, for ice thawing in slow song, for shadows shifting across the bark. The earth was a living calendar, not of numbers, but of patterns. Children learned by doing. They helped gather berries, listened as elders spoke of when to fish, when to rest, when to pray. They weren't taught to conquer the land, they were taught to respect it. And in that respect, they found balance. Let us linger in that balance a little longer. There were no passports, no walls carved into the earth. Yet trade flourished, not by force, but by friendship. From the Great Lakes to the Gulf, from ocean cliffs to desert stone, goods moved with purpose. Shells became beads, obsidian became knives, corn became stories. People met at rivers, shared language through gesture, welcomed strangers with gifts instead of suspicion. These networks weren't drawn on maps. They were drawn in memory, marked by trust, maintained by respect. The land itself was the marketplace, the trail, the treaty. And the things exchanged were not just objects. They were ideas, beliefs, dreams. Still today, the rivers remember the canoes. They danced not for spectacle, but for balance. Each step a story, each drumbeat a prayer. Feathers moved like whispers from the sky, and fire crackled like old voices coming home. Ceremonies weren't performances. They were living bridges between worlds, between what is seen and what is felt, between body and spirit, between the people and the land that cradled them. In open clearings, beneath the stars, they gathered, not to be seen, but to connect, to say thank you without speaking, to keep the stories alive with rhythm, ash, and breath. And when the dance ended, the earth was never quite the same. For them, sacredness wasn't hidden in temples. It was woven into everything, in the way water was offered before drinking, in the songs sung while planting seeds, in the pause before hunting, to thank the animal for its life. There were no lines between the spiritual and the daily, no hour set aside for reverence, because every hour was sacred. Even the quiet moments, mending a basket, watching smoke rise, walking beside a river, held weight. It wasn't about worship, it was about relationship. To live well meant to live with awareness, of breath, of balance, of belonging. And so we continue into the final echoes of this untouched world. Even now, if you walk the woods with care, you might find them. Stones arranged in gentle circles, tree scars shaped by human hands, burial mounds sleeping beneath the moss. These were not ruins. They were reminders that people were here, that they lived, loved, and left behind quiet traces of being. A fishing hook carved from bone, a clay bowl hardened by fire, a single feather tied with intention to a branch. History is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers, and the land still listens. So let us carry these whispers into what comes next. Before we go forward, pause with me. What part of this world stayed with you? Was it the way they walked in silence? The stories spoken in flame? The way even a feather could carry meaning? If something stirred in you, if a detail opened your eyes, leave a comment below. Share what echoed, what still lingers. Let's honor these voices together by remembering out loud. And then the sails appeared, white shapes on the sea, foreign and full of hunger. The land didn't cry out. It listened. The people didn't flee. They watched. And as the ships grew closer, so did the questions. Who are they? Why are they here? And what happens when two worlds meet with no common map? Let us step forward now, into cold winds, wooden ships, and the long winter to come. They came in silence, carried by wind and want, wooden ships creaking like tired bones over a sea too wide to understand. The Pilgrims weren't heroes. They were wanderers, holding on to scraps of hope stitched with fear. Storms had battered their minds. Salt had soaked their skin. Many had already been lost before their feet touched land. But still they believed in something, a new beginning, a place to plant not just seeds, but faith. As they stood on the shore, the trees were strangers, the wind a foreign tongue, the silence heavier than the sea, and still they stepped forward. The land did not welcome them. It waited. Snow whispered between the branches. The trees stood still, watching. There were no maps, no signs, only cold breath and unfamiliar hills. The Pilgrims built small fires, but the wind stole their warmth. They whispered prayers, but the silence swallowed them whole. Food was scarce, water unsure, and the forest beautiful, but filled with shadows they didn't know how to name. They dug shallow shelters, huddled close, listened to wolves in the dark. Some began to write, not about hope, but about hunger, and yet the land still listened. That first winter did not ask for names. It simply took them. One by one, the sick grew still. The weak grew silent. Mothers whispered lullabies to children who wouldn't wake. Fathers dug frozen earth with hands that could barely hold on. Each morning, more were gone. And still the snow fell, quiet and slow, as if trying to cover the truth. There were no grand ceremonies, no carved stones, only graves marked by memory, and those too tired to remember. But even then, in the hush of frost and loss, some held on. Not because they were strong, but because they refused to let go. Let us walk with them a little further. By February, the trees had become their companions, not for comfort, but for burning. They chopped endlessly, arms sore, backs aching. Logs became walls, twigs became kindling. Ash covered their hands like winter dust. Inside the shelters, smoke hung low, eyes watered, but the fire was life, even as its breath stung their lungs. Outside, the snow showed no mercy. It swallowed footprints, buried tools, made every step a test. Still, they worked, cut, hauled, built, because each day they stood was a day not taken. One morning, as the ice still clung to the bay, a figure appeared. Not from sea, but from forest. He spoke English, clear, careful, strange. His name was Samoset. And with that single word, welcome, the tide of silence shifted. The Pilgrims stared, not in fear, but in disbelief. He asked for beer, laughed like wind in spring, and promised to return with more. He did, and he was not alone. Sometimes hope arrives not in thunder, but in footsteps across frost. Then came Squanto. Not a ghost, but a bridge. He had sailed across oceans, survived captivity, returned to a homeland changed. Yet here he stood, among strangers, offering help. He showed them how to plant corn, where to fish, how to use the land without wounding it. He spoke their tongue, understood their hunger, guided them like a lantern through fog. Without him, the story might have ended here, buried beneath the snow. But with him, it continued, not perfectly, not peacefully, but forward. When the snow finally loosened its grip, the ground did not greet them with ease. It was stubborn, cold, heavy with secrets. But it was soil, and that meant hope. Squanto showed them how to use fish as offering, a gift to the earth for what it might give in return. They planted in silence, hands deep in the damp, dreams deeper still. Each seed was more than food. It was a promise, a defiance, a prayer. Around them, the trees began to bloom again. The air lost its bite. Children stepped outside without trembling. It wasn't triumph, but it was something close to breath. They had come to conquer, but now they were learning to listen. The forest was no longer just background. It was a teacher. They learned which herbs healed, which berries fed, and which deceived. Children began to laugh again, running through ferns without fear. They fished the rivers, watched the sky for signs, planted with rhythm instead of desperation. Not all was peaceful, not all was simple, but life had returned, and in that slow, uneven rhythm, they found something unexpected, a beginning. They would never be the same, these settlers. Not after the frost, not after the graves, not after the kindness of strangers who owed them nothing. And yet they had been helped. Not because they deserved it, but because someone chose to offer it. A gift freely given is not easily forgotten. The Pilgrims began to see. Not all wisdom wears a cross. Not all power builds with stone. Some strength lives in knowing the land, in walking barefoot on pine needles, in silence that speaks louder than sermons. They had much to learn, but they had started, and that mattered. Summer arrived not with trumpet or parade, but with open hands. The river no longer froze. The forest no longer whispered danger. Crops began to rise. Slowly, like the breath of someone learning to trust again. There was fish, there were berries, and sometimes there was even laughter. They fixed what could be fixed, mended what was torn, began to think beyond survival. There was still sorrow, but it no longer filled every corner. The sun stayed longer. Nights were less sharp, and the land, once a stranger, now felt something like home. If you had stood among them, what would you have felt? Would you have been afraid of the trees? Grateful for the fire, suspicious of the stranger, or relieved to see him? These are not just old stories. They are mirrors. So if something in this journey touched you, leave a comment. Which moment stayed with you? Which face, which flame, which whisper? Let's remember this winter together, and honor the fact that some made it through. In the end, they survived. They planted. They learned. They buried. They began again. But what happened next has become the legend. A table, a meal, a coming together. Or was it? What truly happened that autumn? Let us go now, beyond the paintings, beyond the stories told in classrooms, and ask, was it peace, or was it something else? Think of Thanksgiving. What do you see? A long wooden table, feathers and hats, corn and turkey, laughter shared between pilgrims and native people, sitting side by side in peace. We've all seen the image. It hangs in classrooms. It lives in coloring books. But that image was painted centuries later, not from memory, but from imagination. It's beautiful, yes, but is it true? Let's peel back the paint. Let's look beyond the smiles and into the silence behind them. Because sometimes what we're taught to remember isn't what really happened. There are only two written accounts of what we call the first Thanksgiving. Two. And they don't mention turkey. They don't mention long speeches. They don't say much at all. Just that the settlers hunted for days. That the Wampanoag arrived, not with feathers in parade, but with 90 men. That they stayed for 3 days. That there was food. That there was shooting. That there was something. But it wasn't called Thanksgiving. It wasn't planned as a celebration. It wasn't the neat image we've been given. It was survival. It was politics. It was tension beneath the table. And still, it happened. Let's sit closer. It wasn't about gratitude. Not really. It was about diplomacy, about watching each other carefully, about knowing winter was coming again, and wondering who would survive it. The Wampanoag were not guests. They were powerful. They had warriors. They had seen disease tear through their people just years before. The Pilgrims were fragile. They needed allies, and corn, and peace, at least for a moment. So they ate together. Yes, but they also watched and waited. Because in a land too new to trust, a shared table wasn't just about food. It was strategy. The event was not called a feast. It was never meant to echo through time. But over generations, memory bent. Details softened. The sharp edges of tension were wrapped in lace and linen. What began as survival became celebration. What was political became personal. And slowly, a moment of uncertainty was painted into a symbol of peace. Children were taught it was kindness, that two worlds shook hands, that the meal meant harmony. But meals end, and stories. They don't always match the silence that followed. Still, the image grew roots. There were no speeches that day, no great declarations, no promises written on paper. But there was meaning. In the way hands moved slowly across the table, in the cautious glances shared across firelight, in the silence between bites. The Wampanoag didn't need to speak loudly. Their presence was its own language, and the Pilgrims, still uncertain, listened. This was not a celebration. It was a moment held carefully, like a cup too full, threatening to spill. Words may fade, but the way someone looks at you across a fire, that stays. The smiles in paintings make it feel like everyone agreed. But peace is not a smile, and a shared meal doesn't erase history. The Wampanoag were watching, They had seen ships before. They had seen what followed. And the Pilgrims, though grateful, still held weapons near their boots. They all ate, but no one forgot what lay just beyond the tree line. The fear, the hunger, the unknown. A smile can be kindness, or armor, or both. So let's not just ask what they ate. Let's ask what they were thinking. As years passed, the story was retold, but only parts of it. The silence grew louder. The Wampanoag voices faded from the page. Their names, their losses, their warnings vanished beneath layers of polite fiction. Instead, we got smiles, feasts, paper hats, and handprint turkeys. The real story, the uneasy alliance, the fragile truce, the cost of survival, was too complex, too uncomfortable. So it was trimmed, shaped, rewritten, and with every retelling the truth grew fainter, like footsteps erased by falling snow. We could have told it differently. We could have said, two peoples met, not knowing what would come, and tried for a moment to understand. We could have remembered the tension, the hunger, the grief. We could have honored the complexity, but we didn't. We chose a story with a neat beginning, a warm middle, and no end. We turned it into a ritual, a holiday, a legend. And somewhere in that soft retelling, we lost something sacred, the truth of what it costs to sit at the same table. But stories can be reclaimed, even now. The meal ended. The fire cooled. The guests went home, or back into the woods. But the story stayed. And today we still set tables. We still speak of gratitude. We still echo a moment we never fully understood. But the truth doesn't disappear. It lingers. In the land, in the silence, in the families who remember what wasn't said. So when we gather, when we pass the food, when we give thanks, we can also listen, because the table still holds it all, the myth, the memory, the meaning we choose to carry. Let us carry it with care. The meal ended. The stories continued. But not all stories are loud. Some liven glances in the way a cup is passed, in what is not said. The truth of that autumn day. It doesn't need to be perfect to matter. It was flawed, tense, brief. But it happened. And the echoes still move through us, in how we gather, in what we forget, in what we choose to teach. The myth is not the enemy. For many, it was a place to begin. But we are allowed to grow deeper. Let's keep listening. Now that we've sat together beneath the autumn light, beside the old fire, what stayed with you? Was it the silence? The way truth softened over time? The hand that passed the food? Or the one that stayed resting near a musket? These stories are meant to stir, not to accuse, but to awaken. If one moment made you pause, leave a comment. Tell us what you saw between the words. what you heard in the spaces between, because remembering is something we can do together. The first meal passed into memory, then into myth, then into ritual. But how did it become a holiday? Why, centuries later, did leaders choose to formalize a moment that may not have been peace at all? Who shaped the version we now celebrate? And what was happening in America when Thanksgiving was finally named? To answer that, we must step beyond the forest, into war rooms, into politics, into the minds of presidents. Let us follow the trail from table to tradition. It began with memory, but memory alone doesn't make a holiday. As generations passed, that quiet meal in the forest began to shift, from tale to tradition, from hearth to headline. Families kept it alive in homes. Churches echoed it from pulpits, but it was still scattered, still unclaimed by the nation itself, until leaders saw its use. In times of unrest, a holiday can become a message. And so, slowly, what was once a moment of gathering became an idea ready for naming. It was not peace that made Thanksgiving official. It was war. In 1863, while the nation bled from both sides, President Abraham Lincoln reached for unity. Not with weapons, but with words. He declared a national day of thanks to be held in November. Not because the harvest demanded it, not because the myth was complete, but because the people needed something to hold. Gratitude became a thread, and Lincoln hoped, even for one day, it might stitch the torn flag back together. So the story was chosen, not because it was perfect, but because it could comfort. And comfort was needed more than truth. But even before Lincoln, there was a voice, persistent, poetic, persuasive. Her name was Sarah Josepha Hale. For decades, she wrote letters to presidents, essays in magazines. She dreamed of a national day that could unite harvest and heart. To her, Thanksgiving wasn't about pilgrims. It was about peace, family, moral virtue. And she believed deeply that stories, if told right, could shape a nation. She didn't wear a uniform, but she changed history with a pen. Lincoln may have signed the paper, but Sarah wrote the dream. As Thanksgiving spread, it wore different masks. For some, it was a day of prayer. For others, a time for community meals, parades, and pies. Newspapers printed recipes. Churches preached about gratitude. Schools taught a soft-edged story, one with bonnets and feathers, but not tension. In each town, each decade, the meaning shifted slightly. Some called it sacred, others sentimental, but all agreed it was American, and slowly that label became more important than the truth. In 1939, the calendar moved, and America got confused. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, hoping to help the economy, shifted Thanksgiving a week earlier to lengthen the holiday shopping season. It sparked outrage. Some called it Franksgiving. States were split. Some celebrated one date, others another. Dinner tables sat awkwardly between arguments. Families disagreed. Governors protested. Because Thanksgiving by then was not just a day. It was a rhythm, a ritual, a memory anchor, and tampering with it, even for business, felt like changing the music of the nation. Eventually, the last Thursday of November was fixed, but the fracture lingered. By the mid-1900s, Thanksgiving looked timeless. Table settings felt ancient. Recipes felt inherited. The story felt sacred. But much of it was invented. The menu, reconstructed. The outfits, imagined. The smiling feast, romanticized. And yet, does that make it false? Or does tradition live in what we choose to repeat? Every culture edits memory. Every nation polishes the past. Thanksgiving became less about the facts and more about the feeling it delivered. But beneath the softness, a question remained. What are we truly celebrating? And who gets to decide? By the mid-20th century, Thanksgiving had found a home in schools. Children traced turkey hands. They wore paper hats and feathers. They colored cheerful scenes of sharing and smiles. The message was simple. Pilgrims were brave. Natives were kind. And the meal was a handshake of peace. No hunger, no death, no power. Just kindness. It was comforting, memorable, and incomplete. But once a story is taught early, it sticks, like glue, like glitter, like a truth too tidy to question. As the story settled into classrooms, the streets began to echo it. Parades filled cities. Marching bands, floats, and giant balloons turned Thanksgiving into spectacle. Television brought it home. The Macy's parade became ritual. So did pumpkin pie, football, and the scent of something roasting. It was no longer just memory. It was performance. A show of plenty, of Americana, of unity, real or rehearsed. And in the background, quietly, the original meal faded into mist. It had become a backdrop to something larger, louder, and carefully choreographed. Then came the turkeys, not on the table, but at the White House. By the late 20th century, presidents began pardoning turkeys, a gesture at once humorous and symbolic. Smiling crowds, feathers fluffed, photos snapped. But beneath the humor, something interesting stirred. Thanksgiving had become political theater. Presidents used it to speak of unity, to remind Americans what to value, to tell a version of history that felt soft enough to hold. In that moment, the bird was spared, but the story stayed controlled. And still, the meal itself whispered beneath the ceremony, wondering if anyone still heard it. By now, Thanksgiving had settled in, not just on the calendar, but in the bones of the home. Families passed down recipes like heirlooms. Grandparents set the table with quiet reverence. Even the arguments about football or politics became part of the rhythm. The day became less about the past and more about return. Coming home, pausing time, rehearsing gratitude, even if only for a meal. And the myth, now faded, still floated in the background, like the scent of something baking. Because sometimes meaning lives more in repetition than in accuracy. Now that we've walked through time, from cold forest tables to parade floats to presidential speeches, tell me, what does Thanksgiving mean to you? Is it family, food, gratitude, or is it a complicated mix of stories and silence? Leave a comment, share your moment, a memory, a feeling, a tradition. Because this holiday, like all stories, lives longer when it is spoken, even quietly, even here. We began in the woods, with cold breath and cautious hands. Now we end in the warmth of memory, ritual, and reflection. But this story isn't done, because Thanksgiving is not just what we do, but how we choose to do it. In the next chapter, we look around, at cities and farms, at tables big and small, at how a nation pauses, together differently. Because even if the myth is blurry, the pause is real, and what we do with it still matters. It was 1863. The country was torn in two, brother against brother. States split by fire and belief. The Civil War raged, and the land trembled under its weight. In the middle of this darkness, leaders looked for something, anything, to hold the pieces together. A moment, a symbol, a pause. And so, eyes turned to Thanksgiving, not just as a meal, but as a message. That even in war, a country could give thanks. That even divided, there could be one shared table, if only imagined. On October 3, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln took up his pen. He declared a national day of Thanksgiving, to be held each November. His words were careful, hopeful, laced with sorrow and longing. He called on Americans to thank God for blessings, even in war, to heal wounds, to remember mercy. And just like that, a quiet regional custom became national. It was not about turkeys then, not about pilgrims, but about unity in the heart of suffering. A day to remember we are one people, even when we bleed on different sides. But Lincoln was not alone. Behind the proclamation stood a woman, persistent, visionary, and determined. Her name was Sarah Josepha Hale. For decades, she had written, petitioned, pleaded, urging presidents to make Thanksgiving a national day. An editor, a poet, the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb. She saw the day as more than food. She saw it as a thread, something to bind a scattered nation. And finally, in 1863, Lincoln listened. One woman's quiet voice helped shape a holiday still echoing now. The war ended, but the wounds did not. Families mourned, towns rebuilt, flags hung heavy even in peace. And yet, each November, Americans paused. Lincoln's proclamation had planted a seed. Even in silence, even in grief, people gave thanks for survival, for reunion, for the small mercy of still being here. And so, Thanksgiving became not just a feast, but a quiet ritual of healing. Each year, the day whispered, "We are still here," and that was enough. As the decades passed, the country grew. Railroads stitched land together, cities swelled, new states joined the flag, and Thanksgiving followed them. From New England to California, from prairie homesteads to urban flats, the meal traveled. Each family gave it their own flavor. Each table told a different story. In immigrant neighborhoods, turkey shared the plate with tamales, dumplings, or collard greens. And yet, they all called it Thanksgiving. Because a holiday is not just a date, it's a mirror. And this mirror reflected a growing, complicated, restless America. Year after year, presidents spoke. Some wrote proclamations by hand. Others had aides draft them. But the ritual remained. A message from the highest office to every dinner table. Words of unity, of humility, of national purpose. In times of war, they spoke of peace. In times of fear, they called for courage. Thanksgiving had become a sacred address, not from a pulpit, but from a podium. And as the president spoke, millions listened, perhaps not with ears, but with a silent nod over mashed potatoes. By the 20th century, presidential proclamations had changed tone. No longer just solemn, they became performance. Polished speeches, camera-ready smiles, televised moments with perfect lighting. Thanksgiving was still sacred, but also strategic. A chance to show leadership, compassion, stability. A president's words over turkey became part of the pageantry. And while the message stayed soft, the meaning shifted. Thanksgiving was no longer just a pause, but a platform, and America was watching. During times of national crisis, Thanksgiving adapted. In the Great Depression, it offered hope on empty plates. During war, it reminded soldiers and families what they were fighting for. After tragedies, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, pandemics, presidents leaned on the holiday to steady the people. They spoke of unity, of compassion, of light that flickered but did not die. And in these moments, the holiday returned to its quiet roots. Not spectacle, not myth, but survival. A candle still burning, even in storm. And so the rhythm continued. A date on the calendar, a tradition of words, a brief national breath. Some years it felt heartfelt, others hollow, but always it arrived. And with it, the voices of presidents past and present echoed into living rooms. Newspapers reprinted proclamations. News anchors quoted lines. Children recited phrases in school. And still, around tables big and small, people listened, or didn't, as the official voice of Thanksgiving greeted the nation once more. An old echo, dressed in modern clothes. Over time, Thanksgiving became more than a proclamation. It became inheritance, passed from president to child, from ancestor to descendant, like a set of old silverware. It lived in the creak of the table, in the way we fold napkins, in the pause before we speak. Presidents still proclaimed, but families quietly made it their own. Children asked why we celebrate. Grandparents answered with stories, some true, some softened. And so, a holiday once born of politics became personal and oddly sacred. And now, if you follow the story this far, through war, words, and wisdom, ask yourself, what part of Thanksgiving lives in your home? Is it a recipe? A prayer? A song no one sings right, but everyone joins in? Leave a comment, share your tradition, even if it's just sleeping in. Because stories don't end in books. They live in moments like this, in memories shared, in rituals repeated. Let's keep this one going, together. Thanksgiving was once a speech. Now it is a song of small things, of repeated meals, of mismatched chairs, of quiet, flickering gratitude. From Lincoln's parchment to your kitchen table, the thread holds. But what happens when a holiday becomes habit? What do we carry forward? And what have we left behind? In the next chapter, we step out of speeches and into homes. Because the true meaning of Thanksgiving is not what the president says, but what you do when the doorbell rings. No matter how the years change, the table remains. Chairs may shift, recipes evolve, but the rhythm endures. One person carves, another pours. A child reaches early and someone laughs. It's a quiet choreography written over generations. And though it looks different in every home, the feeling hums the same tune. Together, warmth, ritual. This is not just food, it's memory made edible, and every dish is a page in a story we eat each year. The turkey changes, stuffing shifts. Cranberries come in jars or fresh picked. but something lingers, beneath gravy and spice. It remembers hunger. It remembers frost. It remembers survival. The first Thanksgiving meals were meager, hard-won, sometimes desperate. Now, the plates overflow, but the shadow of scarcity still shapes the feast. Why else do we overcook, overeat, make room for 5 pies? Because somewhere inside us, the body still whispers, be full, be safe, be still. The food remembers, and so do we. The plate moves from hand to hand. A scoop of potatoes, a slice of bread, a nod, a smile, a quiet thanks. We don't think of it, but it is a ceremony. In that gesture, we say, I have enough and I share. It echoes the first feast, whether myth or truth. People sitting together, choosing peace over distance. Even in silence, the passing matters, because tradition lives not in big speeches, but in small kindnesses repeated, year after year, bite after bite. Then came the parades, balloons bigger than houses, marching bands echoing off tall buildings, Broadway dancers in November wind. It began as a storefront celebration, a way to sell, to dazzle, to gather. But it grew, and somehow it stayed. Now, millions watch as cartoon giants float above cities, a national exhale held in helium and brass. It's loud, it's bright, it's strange, and yet every year we tune in, not for depth, but for delight. Somewhere, a television hums. Cleats scrape turf. Crowds roar. A kickoff spirals into sky. Football and Thanksgiving. An unlikely marriage. Yet somehow it works. It fills the space between courses. It bridges awkward silences. It gives the unspoken something to point at. Across couches and recliners, across time zones and teams, the game plays on. Not just as sport, but as seasonal soundtrack. A thud of tradition, a crash of helmets, a shared cheer, or groan. And even those who don't watch know it's part of the day. A background beat to the gravy and pie. But for all the noise, there's always a moment of stillness. Somewhere between second helpings and dessert, the room softens. Voices lower, cheeks glow, eyes drift toward windows. And in that hush, a strange kind of magic breathes. No one says it, but it's there. This is rare. This is good. This won't last forever. The moment flickers, then fades, and the chatter returns. But it was there, and that quiet, even more than the feast, is the true tradition. Someone always makes one, a centerpiece. Maybe it's a candle wreath. Maybe it's just pine cones in a bowl. It might not match. It might fall over. It might catch fire once a year. But it means something. It says, "This moment matters. We came together on purpose. We noticed." Because tradition isn't about perfection. It's about intention. And a centerpiece in all its awkward beauty reminds us, even a simple table can be sacred. And then, there's the seat that stays empty. Maybe they passed. Maybe they moved. Maybe they just couldn't make it this year. Still, their presence lingers. Someone says their name. Someone saves their spot. Someone laughs like they used to. Grief has its own seat at the table. Always has. And Thanksgiving, for all its joy, makes room for ache. Not to overshadow, but to honor. Because remembering is its own kind of gratitude. Sometimes someone shows up who wasn't expected. Or someone speaks first when it was hardest. A cousin returns. A mother and daughter finally hug. An old friend is let back in. Thanksgiving holds these moments too. The soft, unspoken forgiveness. The truce without terms. It may not be perfect. It may not last. But in the flicker of a candle, a history can shift. Because tradition isn't just what we repeat. It's what we dare to change. Tradition rarely shouts. It whispers. It waits in the drawer with the chipped serving spoon. It hides in the song you don't remember learning. It's in the napkin folded a certain way, the toast given by the quiet uncle, the final slice saved for someone late. These things, they seem small, but they are anchors. Not to hold us back, but to remind us we belong somewhere, even for just one meal. So now, tell me, what's your small tradition? The one no one else would understand, but you'd miss if it vanished. Maybe it's a certain seat you always take, a word you always say, a pie with the wrong crust, because it's yours. Leave a comment, share a moment, not for the algorithm, but for the story, for the thread, because these rituals, when named, become real, and together we carry them. We've sat at the table. We've remembered the hands that passed us the bread. But Thanksgiving is more than kitchens and centerpieces. It echoes in football stadiums, in soup kitchens, in airports, in the silence of a walk alone. How does an entire country pause at once? In the next chapter, we leave the dining room behind and step into America itself. Because to understand Thanksgiving fully, we must see not just how it began, but how it lives today, everywhere. In the heart of the city, something rare happens. The honking fades. The streets clear. Shops shutter early. A city that never stops. Stops. And for one soft day, steel and glass give way to stillness. Pigeons perch where sirens used to wail. Leaves blow through empty intersections. Light pools on pavement. It's not that the city sleeps, it's that it exhales. And for a few golden hours we remember, even noise needs rest. Even concrete deserves quiet. Across the country, wheels turn. Not for errands, but for reunions. Suitcases in trunks. Snacks on dashboards. Kids asleep in the back. Some travel hours. Some days. Motels flicker to life. Gas stations glow under cold skies. These highways, they hold more than traffic. They carry intention. They carry hope. They carry the quiet promise. I'll be there. Even if it's just once a year. Even if it's not easy. We go home. At the airport, there is motion, but also meaning. Delayed flights, long lines, tired eyes, but also signs with names, flowers in backpacks, tears on escalators. Thanksgiving happens here too, in gate reunions, in first hellos, in long, silent hugs. Not every feast needs a table. Sometimes it just needs a gate number and someone waiting. That, too, is celebration. That, too, is coming home. Not every Thanksgiving has a home, but it can still have a table. Outside a small brick building, a line forms early. No menus, no music, just need. Inside, steam, smiles, plastic trays passed from stranger to stranger. No one asks your story, just mashed potatoes and would you like pie? Here, gratitude is not a luxury. It's survival, and kindness, served hot. Because in this place, Thanksgiving isn't about having. It's about being seen. In a quiet hospital corridor, someone opens a styrofoam box. Turkey. Gravy, still warm. A nurse sits down for 5 minutes, maybe 3. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead. A heart monitor beeps nearby. Someone, somewhere, is being born. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear name tags. And while families laugh around tables, others give up their own feast to make sure someone else wakes up. This, too, is Thanksgiving. Not in decoration, but in duty. And sometimes, you're not at home. You're far away. New city. New job, no plans. And then someone says, "Come over," even though you barely know them. You bring something small, you take off your shoes, you feel unsure. And then someone passes you the rolls. The laughter begins, and you realize this is enough. Thanksgiving isn't always familiar, but it can still be warm. And sometimes A stranger's welcome becomes your favorite tradition. Some watch it from the sidewalk, others from the couch. The parade arrives with giant balloons, marching bands, and confetti falling like leaves. On television, it all looks perfect. In real life, a child drops their cocoa. A drum line misses a beat. But that's the point. It's not about flawlessness. It's about rhythm, joy, and the shared breath of a million eyes watching at once. The nation gathers, even if only on the same channel. And for a moment, we are one. In backyards across the country, laughter rises like breath in the cold. A football is thrown. A mitten is lost. A dog barks wildly. Children run in oversized coats. Uncles argue over scores. Someone falls and everyone cheers. The grass is half frozen. The rules are made up. The score doesn't matter, but the moment does. These games, these rituals, are the rough-edged joy that makes the feast taste better. Because play, too, is sacred. And then, quiet. Bellies full, voices hoarse, plates stacked in the sink. Someone puts on boots, grabs a scarf, steps into dusk. The street is calm. The air smells of chimney smoke. Leaves crunch underfoot. No one talks, and that's okay. Because Thanksgiving isn't just about gathering. It's also about stepping back, to think, to breathe, to remember. The world keeps turning gently after the meal is done. There is always one. An empty chair, a name not spoken out loud but felt. Maybe they moved. Maybe they passed. Maybe they simply couldn't make it. But the space remains, and in that space, love. A plate still set, a candle lit, a pause held just long enough. Because Thanksgiving is not only joy, it's memory, and remembering is a form of gratitude, too. If someone is missing from your table this year, you're not alone. If you're celebrating differently, that's okay too. Every version of Thanksgiving matters. So, take a moment. Tell me about yours. What did you do today? What do you always do? What small piece of this day matters most to you? Leave a comment, not for attention, but for connection. Because in sharing, we stitch a quilt, one made of all our stories, and that is something to be thankful for. The dishes are done, the leftovers stored, the laughter fading to hum, and in that hush, a country dreams of what it has, of what it's lost, of what it hopes to keep. But not everyone's story is told at this table. Some voices go unheard, some stories unsaid, and as we drift into the quiet, we ask, who did we forget? In the next chapter, we listen for the missing voices, because gratitude, to be whole, must include them too. We talk of the first Thanksgiving, but not of who was missing. Long before ships touched shore, this land had names. Rivers had stories. Mountains had songs. The Wampanoag were here, and others too. They hunted, they farmed, they thrived, and then came famine, and then came disease, and then came strangers. The story we tell of shared meals and peace is only part of the page. The rest was written in silence, but silence is not forgetting, and today we begin to remember. Corn, beans, squash, techniques of survival, shared by those who had no need to. They showed how to grow, how to gather, how to last a winter, and, in return, broken promises, seized lands, vanished names. Thanksgiving speaks of gratitude, but what of the ones who gave and were then erased? What of the knowledge kept in soil and the people scattered to wind? To remember fully, we must look backward, even if it stings. They are still here, not in museums, not in myths, but in life, in classrooms, in protests, in songs sung at sunrise. Thanksgiving, for many, is not a celebration. It is resistance, remembrance. A fire carried from those who refused to disappear. To honor the holiday, we must also honor the hurt, because survival is sacred too, and sometimes the bravest thing to do is to still be here, still singing, still standing, still telling the story. Imagine a feast, laughter, light, warmth, and now imagine the door never opens for you. For many, Thanksgiving is not a welcome. It's a memory of what was taken. Tribes displaced, ceremonies banned, children stolen, a holiday of harvest built on loss. Yet still, some gather anyway. They cook their own foods, speak their own tongues, hold their own rituals, because healing doesn't ask for permission. It begins in truth. Not all harvests were joyful. Some hands did not gather freely. They were bound, watched, beaten. Slavery fed the early feasts, and its shadow lingers still. cotton fields, tobacco barns, sugar cane. And yet, within the songs sung in hidden huts, within the spices passed in secret, there was defiance. A feast, even in chains, became sacred, because memory cannot be erased, only buried, until it grows back, like roots breaking through stone. Far from their own harvests, they arrived, carrying hope wrapped in cloth. Migrants, refugees, dreamers, often not invited to the table, but building the kitchen. Thanksgiving, to them, is not nostalgia. It's learning new spices, new neighbors, new silence. They bring food that isn't on postcards, plant roots where none were offered, and in doing so, expand what this holiday can mean. Because belonging is built, one shared meal at a time. History is loud, but some voices come in whispers. They weren't in the textbooks, they weren't on the holiday cards, but they were there, cooking, serving, watching. Native women, black cooks, Chinese railroad workers, Latino field hands. Each one a thread in the meal's fabric, and still their names are missing. To celebrate fully, we must ask, whose story built this feast, and why were they never thanked? Gratitude is not owned by one nation. It blooms in refugee tents, in prison cells, in small villages after the storm. It is found in the sigh after safety, the hush after hunger, the light that stays on. Thanksgiving, in its best form, is not patriotic. It is human. And the moment we make it only American, we shrink it. Because gratitude, true gratitude, belongs to all who endure, and that makes it holy. In a classroom one November, a child raises their hand. Why do we celebrate? The teacher pauses. Do you tell the version with smiles and pies, or the one with ships and tears? Maybe both. Because the child deserves more than legend. They deserve truth, and wonder, and the right to choose what the day means. The future of this holiday rests not in tradition alone, but in the questions we allow, and the answers we no longer hide. Some have begun to change the day. They call it Truthsgiving, or Day of Mourning, or simply Thursday. But they gather still, to tell the full story, to include every voice, to serve dishes not found in cookbooks. It is not less Thanksgiving. It is more honest, more complete, more human. Because when we widen the table, we find there was always more room. We just had to make it. What does your table look like? Who is there? Who is missing? What song plays in the background? Maybe it's noisy. Maybe it's quiet. Maybe it's not a table at all, but a memory or a phone call or a sky you look up to. Whatever form it takes, your story matters. So leave a comment, tell me your version, and know this: gratitude expands each time a story is shared. We cannot change the past, but we can choose how we remember. We can gather with open hearts. We can listen. We can pause. And in doing so, we turn Thanksgiving into something deeper, a practice of presence, of honoring, of becoming whole. So let us carry these voices forward. And as we close the door on this chapter, we open another, one of quiet reflection, one of memory and meaning. Because gratitude, when truly seen, doesn't end with a meal. It begins with remembrance. As the plates are washed and the candles go out, something lingers. Not the turkey, not the pie, but the stillness, the warmth, the echo of voices once near. Thanksgiving is not just a day. It is a feeling, a pause in the noise, a moment to remember what matters. Even after the guests have left, even after the table is bare, gratitude stays. And in that quiet, something sacred hums, the memory of connection, the holiness of enough. Thanksgiving, at its heart, is a thread, woven through generations, from hands that planted seeds to those that now scroll screens. It links pilgrims and protesters, elders and children, sorrow and celebration. Every version adds to the fabric. Each meal, each voice, a stitch in something bigger. And when we sit in silence, we can feel it. That quiet pull toward meaning. Because history is not just in books. It's in flavors, in songs, in the way we hold one another's stories. If this story stayed with you, even for a moment, leave a like. Not for me, but for the story, for the questions we asked, for the truths we let breathe. Subscribe if you want to keep walking together, into quiet places, into forgotten rooms, into history's softest corners. This isn't about views, it's about vision. A way of seeing the world not as it was told, but as it truly lived. So thank you for listening, for remembering, for caring. The lights go out, the streets quiet down, and across the country, stillness. A child hugs a stuffed bear, a grandmother folds a napkin, a dog dreams beneath a table. Gratitude is not loud. It does not need to be. It is soft, like breath, like snowfall, like memory. So sleep well, America, with your full tables and your aching hearts. with all your history and all your hope. You are not perfect, but tonight you paused, and in that pause, you remembered.